This here is an African Fat-Tailed Gecko, and in today's video I will be educating you on exactly how you can care for this beautiful species. By the end of this video you will have all of the information that you'll need in order to provide outstanding care for this wonderful species. We will be going over their temperature and humidity requirements, all of their dietary needs, and on top of that we will be educating you on everything that you're going to need in order to actually create a thriving enclosure for these little guys to actually live in. This will include information regarding their heating, lighting, substrate, enclosure sizing, and also things like their decor. So let's begin the video. Okay, so to begin with, let's actually talk a bit about these geckos. So African Fat-Tailed Geckos are native to Western Africa. This species of gecko is actually a crepuscular species, which means that they are primarily active during dawn and dusk. This species is a ground-dwelling species, which means that they spend the majority of their time on the ground. Now, as adults, this beautiful species reaches a wonderful size of around 7 to 9 inches. And you may be sat there thinking to yourself, is that not just a leopard gecko? Well, Oreo here certainly does look like a leopard gecko. However, he is certainly not a leopard gecko. He is a African fat-tailed gecko. Now, although leopard geckos and African fat-tailed geckos are very similar and also have very similar care requirements, there are a few minor differences between the different species, which obviously we will be going over today. African fat-tailed geckos are a fairly docile species, although I will say they can be a little bit more skittish than the leopard gecko. And if I'm completely honest, in my personal opinion, I believe that this species is a very underrated species. Most people tend to go for leopard geckos, but if you're thinking of getting something a bit more unique, then this species could be the perfect pet gecko for you. So to begin with, I'm going to go over their dietary requirements. So this species of gecko is an insectivorous species, which means that their diet will consist of eating a variety of different live insects. And this is usually in the form of crickets, locusts, waxworms, mealworms, morio worms, dubia roaches, and silkworms. Now, for baby and juvenile African fat-tailed geckos, I'd recommend feeding them once a day. And once they reach subadult to adult age, you can move their feeding to once every sort of 3 to 4 days. Now, you'll need to make sure that you actually feed an appropriate sized insect. And if you're wondering how can you judge the appropriate size, all you simply have to do is, first of all, find an insect which is smaller than the gap between your gecko's eyes. That is a general rule of thumb and is a good way to judge whether you're feeding an appropriate sized insect. On top of this, make sure that you dust your live food in calcium and multivitamin. Personally, I'd highly recommend the Arcadia line. They do a great calcium supplement and also a multivitamin supplement. So that's virtually everything that you need to know regarding their dietary needs. So now let's move on to their temperature and humidity requirements. So for their temperature, you're going to want to create a hot and cold side of your vivarium. We'll touch more on that when we're actually going over heating. Now, for the cold side of your vivarium, you're going to want to try and achieve a temperature range which is between 22 degrees Celsius to 27 degrees Celsius, which I believe is 71 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And then for your basking spot, now, just so you're aware, your basking spot is basically the area which is directly below the heat lamp. So for your basking spot temperature, you want to try and achieve a temperature range which is between 32 degrees Celsius and 35 degrees Celsius, which is 89 to 95 Fahrenheit. Like I say, your basking spot is basically the hottest point within inside your enclosure, which means that on your hot side, the ambient temperature, which is basically the temperature surrounding the basking area. So for this ambient temperature on the hot side, your temperature is likely going to be between 30 and 32 degrees Celsius, which is 86 to 89 Fahrenheit. Like I say, this is just a general guideline. As long as you're within this range, your gecko is going to be happy and also comfortable. Now moving on to humidity. Now this is where the main difference is between the African fat-tailed gecko and the leopard gecko is. Now, for example, leopard geckos only require around 30 to 40% humidity, whereas because these guys come from Africa, they actually require slightly higher humidity, which is around 40 to 60%. As long as your humidity is within this range throughout the enclosure, your gecko is going to love it. Now, just quickly, for nighttime temperature, I'd recommend trying to keep the temperature above 20 degrees Celsius, which is 68 Fahrenheit. But in all honesty, the absolute minimum that I'd let the temperature drop down to at nighttime would be 18 degrees Celsius, which is around 64 Fahrenheit. Now, if you do notice that your temperature is below 18 degrees Celsius, let's say, then I'd recommend installing a secondary source of heating, which we will go over in a minute. And by adding this second source of heating, this is going to be your nighttime heating system. And this is going to help you keep that temperature above the 18 degrees Celsius. And in all honesty, this will kind of come down to where you actually live. Now, to actually test your temperature and humidity levels, you can get yourself one of these dial thermometer and hygrometers, and basically these just stick to the inside of your enclosure and it will help you to test the temperature and humidity levels. Alternatively, you can get digital versions which look like this. All you need to do is run the probe into the enclosure where you want it to test the temperature and test your humidity. You can also get combinators which do the both, like this white python one, and also Exoterra make a version. Now, for testing your temperature, personally, I'd highly recommend one of these Exoterra infrared thermometers. The reason why I like to use this thermometer is it allows me to test the temperatures across the entire enclosure rather than just in one specific spot. Next of all, I'd recommend placing a small water dish into their enclosure, and this will allow your gecko to actually drink from in order to stay hydrated. On top of that, I would recommend placing a small dish with calcium inside it into the enclosure. The reason why I would recommend doing this is because it allows your gecko to have access to calcium 24/7 if they feel like they need topped up on it. So next up, you're going to want to know what size enclosure should you be providing to your African fat-tailed geckos. Now, I will say that this species doesn't require a large enclosure. So for baby or juvenile African fat-tailed geckos, I'd recommend getting yourself one of these vivariums, which is a 2 foot wide by 1.5 foot deep by 1.5 foot high. Like we mentioned earlier, this species is a ground dwelling species, so they don't really require much height to their enclosure. You're definitely going to want an enclosure with more width than height. Now, once your gecko has reached adulthood, I'd highly recommend upsizing your vivarium to this size enclosure. This is a 3 foot wide by 1.5 foot deep by 1.5 foot high. Now, this is what I would class as the minimum requirement for this gecko species, but if you want to go for something like a 4x2x2, they will make use of that size enclosure. So in all honesty, it's just personal preference, but like I say, this is the minimum that I would offer to an adult gecko. So now that you have a good idea on what size enclosure you want for your gecko, let's move on to talk about their heating and lighting systems. Now, just quickly, your heating system will depend on the size of enclosure which you go for. So to begin with, I'm going to go over the heating for the small 2 foot vivarium, and then we will go over the heating system for if you're using the 3 foot or 4 foot vivariums. So for the small 2 foot vivarium, I'd recommend installing a heat mat like this one, and simply just run it into your enclosure and have it sat on one side of the enclosure, which is going to create your hot side. I would then also plug this heat mat into a mat stat like this one. Now, this mat stat is a thermostat which will basically help you control and regulate the temperature within inside the enclosure. All you simply do is set the basking temperature on this device, run the probe in, and the sensor will monitor the temperature. So that's what I would do for the 2-foot vivariums. Now let's go over the heating for the 3-foot and 4-foot vivariums. So for both of these size enclosures, what I would recommend doing is first of all getting yourself one of these, which is a ceramic lamp holder. Please make sure it's a ceramic one and not a plastic one, as plastic ones have a tendency to melt over time. All you simply do is screw this unit to the top of your enclosure and keep it to one side of the enclosure to create your hot side. For the bulb itself, I'd recommend using either a 50 watt or 75 watt spotlight bulb, and this should provide enough heat for your gecko. I'd also recommend getting yourself one of these, which is a dimming thermostat, and this again will control and regulate the temperature of the bulb inside the enclosure. It would also be a sensible decision to also get one of these, which is just a guard to go around your bulb, and this will basically stop your gecko from actually climbing on the bulb itself. Now for nighttime heating, if you actually even need it, I'd recommend installing a secondary ceramic lamp holder and then running one of these bulbs in it, which is actually just a ceramic heater emitter, and this bulb basically will give off heat but no light, which is perfect for providing heat during the night. So moving on to their lighting. Now, obviously, I get that this species is a crepuscular species, but in my opinion, I would personally recommend installing UVB anyway. UVB provides a lot of health benefits to your geckos, which is why I would recommend it. So for UVB, I'd recommend getting yourself one of these, which is an 8 watt 7% T5 UVB kit. Please keep in mind that the UVB bulb will only last for 8 to 12 months before needing replacing. Now, since we're on the topic of lighting, if you decide to use live plants inside your enclosure for decor, I would recommend getting yourself one of these, which is a 15 watt jungle dawn, and this LED light will basically help promote plant growth. So that's practically everything that you need to know regarding heating and lighting. Since we're on the topic of plants, let's move on to just talking about decor. So for hides, there are plenty different ones available on the market, and I'd recommend having a minimum of 3 hides, one on the hot side, one on the cold side, but also one as a humid hide. You can also make your own caves, but these geckos do like to be able to hide away, so just make sure you have a minimum of 3. Now for the humid hide, you'll need to add some of this sphagnum moss into that hide, and what this does is it allows the gecko to have access to a higher humidity, and this basically means that the gecko can go to this hide whilst it's shedding, which is basically going to help them remove their shed a lot easier, and it will help prevent stuck shed on their toes and tail. I will be honest, if you're going to experience stuck shed, it's likely going to be on their toes or their tail, so just keep an eye on these areas whilst they're in shed. Like I say, if you can provide more hides though, then that's great. They will make use of all of them. You can also make hides out of these cork bark tubes. I'd definitely recommend adding some cork bark tubes and branches for them to be able to climb on and also hide in. I'd also recommend putting some fake plants into your enclosure, or even live plants, either or. It does come down to personal preference. And again, there's a variety of different fake plants on the market. I'd also highly recommend getting yourself a basking rock, like you can see the gecko going under. The reason why I'd recommend this is because the rock will basically hold and retain the heat from the heat lamp, which is going to provide your gecko with underbelly heat. And this basically will help with digestion. Next up is substrate. Now, if you have a baby or juvenile African Fat-Tailed Gecko, then if I'm honest, I'd probably just recommend using paper towels, because these geckos can be quite clumsy and accidentally ingest substrate, which could unfortunately lead to something like impaction. But once they reach subadult to adult size, then if you want to add substrate, I'd recommend doing a biomix, which consists of using the Arcadia Earth mix, or if you want, you can also use Eco Earth. That will work too, and then simply mix either one of these substrates with 10% desert sand. This biomix will basically provide adequate humidity for your gecko, but also it'll make your enclosure look a lot more natural. So that's substrate pretty much all covered, if I'm honest. Now there are a few other little bits which I would like to quickly go over. Now, African Fat-Tailed Geckos are generally quite docile and fairly slow movers, which makes them a great option for those who want the hands-on experience appearance, but don't want something which is quite fast. They are usually quite acceptable to being handled, so when you're handling, just keep in mind that they are small and somewhat delicate, so just make sure you go slow and let them climb onto you at their own pace. Try and avoid picking them up by the tail, as they can drop their tails just like the leopard gecko can, and as long as you're calm with them, it's very unlikely that they could bite, unless you're causing them stress or making them feel scared, because this is what could lead to you getting a bite. And like I say, as long as you're respectful to them and calm around them, they are going to enjoy your company. In all honesty, these geckos are pretty straightforward to care for and also make a great option for beginners and experts alike. Let us know in the comments what you think about this species, and also if you own one of these African fat-tailed geckos, drop your experiences into the comment section below. I'll make sure to leave links to all of the products which I have mentioned within this video in my description below. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop us a comment and I'll make sure to get back to you. But yeah, I hope that you enjoyed this video and found it valuable. If you did enjoy this video, please feel free to drop us a like to let us know that you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to follow us on our social media. Simply just type in @CoopsReptiles. And if you enjoy learning about reptiles, maybe consider subscribing to the channel. By subscribing, not only do you join our community, but you also play a huge part in my channel growing. We've just hit 450 subscribers, which I'm so proud about, but I am on a mission to hit 1,000 subscribers by the end of this year, and I appreciate everyone who has subscribed to the channel. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching, guys. Oh, and also a huge thank you to Holly at Mid's Art Box for letting us use her African Fat-Tailed Gecko within this video. This little gecko's name is Oreo and it belongs to her. And we are currently looking after Oreo whilst she is away on holiday. So thank you so much, Holly. I really appreciate you letting me use Oreo to be able to put this care guide together. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching, and I suppose I shall see you in my next video. See ya!